Okay, omissions, part of the actus reus. So generally, you are guilty when you commit a positive act. You've got to have the required mens rea as well. So to be guilty of an offence, always state actus reus plus mens rea equals criminal liability. Actus reus is generally a positive act, but sometimes if you have a duty of care, you can be guilty by failing to act. Now, there are certain statutory examples. They come from Acts of Parliament. The Road Traffic Act 1988. It's a crime to not provide a breath specimen. So you have failed to do something. You have failed to provide a breath sample. Parliament also made it a crime under the Children and Young Persons Act 1933. It's a crime to not feed your child. So you are guilty of an offence by not doing something. Now, the vast majority of cases come from common law. So common law omissions are situations created by judges, judge-made law, and judges have said in these situations that you have a duty to act. If you do not act, you could be guilty of a crime. First situation, contractual duty. This is the case of Pitwood. So if there's a contract and you are required to act and you don't, you could be guilty of a crime. So Pitwood was actually guilty of manslaughter. This was the railway crossing worker who he didn't close the gate properly. That was his job, to close the gate. The victim was struck and killed by a train. So he failed to act. It was part of his job, failed to act, guilty of manslaughter. If the defendant has a special relationship, then they have a duty to act. So in the case of Gibbons and Proctor, the father and the partner deliberately starved his child to death. So he has a duty of care, parent, child, he has a duty to act. So clearly he is guilty of murder by failing to feed the child. She argued, well, I'm not the mother, I don't have a duty of care. Courts turned around and said, you do have a special relationship to look after that child, and you should have done so, and you failed to do so, so you are also guilty of murder. The next situation, if there's a voluntary relationship. Case of Stone and Dobinson. So Stone's sister came to stay with them and failed to eat properly. They gave her some food, they tried to get some medical care, but it really wasn't enough, and she then died. Courts turned around and said, well, you voluntarily accepted your responsibility for someone, so therefore you do have a duty to act. You have failed to do so, so you are guilty of manslaughter. The next situation, if the defendant is in an official position. Case of Ditham. Ditham was a police officer on duty. He saw a fight and decided to go off duty, and the victim was kicked to death. So Ditham was guilty of misconduct in a public office. He had a duty to act, and he had failed to do so. The next situation, creating a dangerous situation. So in the case of Miller, Mr. Miller fell asleep while smoking and his mattress was set on fire. That in itself is not a crime. It became a crime the moment he realised his mattress was on fire and decided to do nothing about it. He went into another room and the fire spread. He was charged and convicted of arson. So if you create a dangerous situation, you have a duty to correct it. Finally, something I would just add about omissions is, can you be released from your duty of care? So in the case of Bland, it was decided that doctors can stop treating. They will not be guilty of manslaughter or murder if they fail to treat a patient as long as it was in the patient's best interest. So this was to do with the Hillsborough disaster. Tony Bland was on a life support machine. Doctors wanted to switch it off. And they had to ask the courts, could they be released from their duty of care? Court said yes, they could. So those are the common law omissions. There are quite a few of them, so just think of it as different duties. What's the case? In an exam question, realistically, you're not going to have to put the facts in, but state the duty and state the case name.